Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our June webinar for the ANZSOG Regulators Community of Practice. It's great to have you with us, and for those watching this on YouTube, welcome as well. So today's conversation is around setting regulatory practice at the speed of a pandemic. And we're going to have a conversation around how do you upcycle others' regulators' tools and approaches to avoid reinventing the wheel. We've got a couple of great speakers, and I think what's going to be interesting in this conversation, and COVID is the vehicle for our conversation, but we're going to talk about, well, how do you really pick apart and learn from what others do? And COVID went really quickly. It was a rapid response, and we needed to be highly adaptive. So it's going to be a fascinating conversation. I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and acknowledge their elders past, present, and emerging. For me, that's the Wurundjeri people here in Melbourne. And in a second, I'll welcome our speakers to the session. For those that haven't joined one of these sessions before, we have a Q&A function that you can access from the bottom of your screen. So at any point, feel free to start throwing some questions in there once we kick on. The session will be recorded. So for those that you know wanted to attend or were interested in coming but couldn't join, you can point them back to ANZSOG's YouTube channel, and this presentation will be there. Generally, it's up within a few weeks or so. And there's a few slides that we'll use in the intro, and we'll also make those available. So in terms of how we're going to have this conversation, we'll do a bit of an intro and context setting piece, then I'll introduce our speakers. We'll have a pretty interactive conversation in terms of in a panel format. At any point, that's your timing to jump in there and ask any questions you like. I'll do my best to feed those questions into the conversation, in addition to some of the questions that I have. We'll have one more round of final questions towards the end, and then I'll go to our panelists to give their final thoughts and comments, your takeaways, if you like. And then I'll tell you a bit about what's happening at the next webinar. But let's jump straight into it. I want to really thank our panel members for joining us. Firstly, we've got Chris Webb, who's the Commander of COVID Compliance at Victoria's Department of Health. Chris has been responsible for standing up and running operations to support compliance with the health directions over the last 18 months. Some would say he is grayer than he was 18 months ago. Others would disagree, but no doubt it's been an interesting 18 months. He was previously the exec lead for legislative transformation at EPA Victoria and the architect of the preventative duty model of legislation for environmental regulation. And for those that are familiar with that, quite an important piece of legislation, quite a different tact than in the past. Prior to EPA, he worked at WorkSafe Victoria, where he led the regulation of utilities and the construction industries. Look, he's worked lots of different aspects of regulation. He's worked with lots of teams and built them and got them running and tried innovative things. And he's got a background in risk and safety management, both with the oil industry and major events, which will be interesting because that will feed into some of our conversation. I also want to welcome Leanne Hughson, who's the CEO of Energy Safe Victoria. But prior to joining ESV, Leanne worked at WorkSafe and lots of other regulators for about 13 years in senior roles, including the General Counsel and the ED of Health and Safety and the Chief of Transformation. And prior to that, she was also the Commander of Enforcement and Compliance in the COVID response team at Department of Health. She's got a Bachelor of Arts in Law, a Master's in Taxation. Oh, I didn't know that, Master's in Taxation. And is a graduate from the Harvard Business School and the Australian Institute of Company Directors. Leanne and Chris, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. What's interesting about this space also is that there are still some legal action pending in some of these cases. So there might be some grounds where we may not be able to dig too much. I'll do my best to work in some of the questions, but understand that there's some questions where we might have to just be a little bit cautious in how we address them. So context setting. If we go back to COVID, 2 years ago, we're talking about a period in which things changed really rapidly. We stood up a whole lot of different regulatory architecture relatively quickly. And so the theme of today's conversation, using COVID as, I guess if you like, as one of the test cases for this, is how do you learn from others? How do you stand up things this quickly? How do you pinch, borrow, steal, take, admire, adapt others' regulatory approaches and make it fit for purpose in the climate that we're in, which was highly evolving and highly dynamic. So how do you learn from other regulators? And a bit of the conversation we want to have through the COVID conversation is, well, what did you do? Where did you get those things from? To support that, I'm going to bring up a couple of slides. We're going to frame the conversation in two different ways. The first is using a regulatory approach model. So for those that are familiar with this sort of spectrum model, it's the idea that most regulators tend to undertake similar types of activity. I'm just going to give you a quick narrative around the wheel, and as I'm explaining it, give some thought to the questions you might want to ask, so you can draw out what's going to be useful for you for what you do for the regulator you work in. So Inform and Educate is very much around raising awareness, sometimes in lots of different languages, about what are the rules, what's our expectations, what do we expect duty holders or people to do. Setting standards is very much about articulating those rules into some sort of vehicle, a permit, an exemption, a license, a direction. Supporting to comply is helping people go, well, what does that mean for me in my circumstances? And that tends to be through education or persuasion or compliance advice or what have you. And then we're monitoring compliance with those expectations. And there's lots of ways to do that: inspections, audits, desktop assessments. We could go on and on. And then we're enforcing the law. This idea that enforcing the law has two components: remedy, making good through notices, prohibition notices, improvement notices, directions, etc., and sanctions, fines, penalties, those things that either seek to cast deterrence or seek to recover the economic cost gained by being non-compliant, and then encouraging people to go further. Hey, you're doing this, why don't you think about going a bit further? So in the conversation today, I'll often go back to some of these to be a bit of a leveler between lots of different regulators. So as you're thinking about the questions you want to ask and thinking about how you might transfer this to your regulatory domain, we'll use this reg approach as a bit of a guide. So that's in terms of the questions and how we might frame it. In the next slide, I want to talk to you, well, how do we actually have this conversation around COVID? Because again, going back, we had this period where COVID was at the international level. It wasn't in Australia. So our focus was, how do we keep it out? Then we moved into a phase where it was in Australia, but it wasn't necessarily in Victoria. So how do we stop it from coming across the border? And then we have the situation where it's in Victoria, but it's not widespread. It might be just in the city or bits of the regions. How do we stop it from going widespread? And then we had this last phase where it was pretty much everywhere. And then the question is, how do you adapt to the relative risks and circumstances you've got then? So as we go through this sort of narrative arc, if you like, of the different modes of COVID response, bear this in mind, because as we tell the story, we'll be jumping between these different modes because they often switched and changed mid-cycle. So without further ado, let's jump into it. Leanne, I might come to you first. You were there right at the start when it was international. Maybe it wasn't here yet, and then it started coming in. Can you start the story? How does the story start?
Yeah, thank you, Adam. Hi, everyone. And could I just also acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands upon which we're all meeting today and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I started working as the COVID compliance commander in about June 2020. So you might remember COVID sort of became a thing around March 2020. So the existing staff in Department of Health quickly worked, as we now know, with other departments to stand up the hotel quarantine system. So when I came in about June, that was up and running. And I thought I was just walking into that role, which included making sure that people who were getting off international flights were detained and in hotel quarantine for the 2-week period. There was also a team that looked at people who were requesting exemptions from hotel quarantine. And the reality was no one wanted to go in there, so there were lots of requests for exemption, very few granted though. And at that time, the public health imperative was number one. So we did not want COVID in the community getting widespread. So at that point, we were really regulating movement. We were trying to restrict the movement of people who had come from overseas. As we now know, COVID got out of hotel quarantine and into the community. So at that point, the whole operation really changed, Adam. So you'll remember that there were some high-risk industries where it was really prevalent. So in meatworks, we saw a lot of COVID spreading in meatworks. So there was a lot of work done around how do we stop that happening. There were other high-risk industries as well. So we started to see the health orders being written around, you know, mask wearing, hand washing, you know, how many people could be on site. All of this was pre-vaccination, by the way. So a whole operation was stood up around high-risk industries and trying to manage the movement of people and the interaction of people in those workplaces. Then we started to see it in places like backpackers, rooming houses, or types of living environments where there was condensed living or lots of people. And that became a challenge to sort of limit the movement of those people. And eventually it got into households as well. So one of the other responses was to stand up what we called the Household Engagement Program. And that program had authorised officers in conjunction with the Australian Defence Force knocking on people's doors to make sure, one, they were home isolating like they should be, but two, did they need any support, because people were sort of being locked down at that point, and they needed a whole lot of supports, whether it was food or financial or mental health or whatever it might be, school, kids needing computers. So that program was very broad, mainly focused on support, but also, again, that restriction of movement to make sure people who did have COVID weren't out socialising in the community.
So there's a few switches there. There's the starting point where, you know, you're using airports or ports effectively to restrict people's movement and detain them. In terms of the existing regulatory infrastructure around airports and stopping people and detaining people, I'm assuming that's not novel in the sense of we've already got mechanisms. Was that different? Was that new, or was this something that was always there, we just never enacted it?
Well, there's a piece of legislation in the Health Act that was there, as I understand it, to deal to when AIDS was around, to make sure people weren't, you know, infecting others with AIDS. So in terms of the airports, it was pretty novel, and I talk about airports, but it was seaports as well. So managing the docks and who was getting off ships, trying to understand. The good thing about ships is they know where all the people have been, what ports they've been in. They keep really good logs. So it was managing all of those people who were coming from places that had a lot of COVID, making sure that they didn't come in. So we've got really good protocols around border force, customs. There are some great procedures in place, particularly with ships when there's people who might be bringing an infectious disease in. But in terms of standing up a bunch of authorised officers who read a notice to people, tell them we're going to put them in detention for 2 weeks, basically, if you like. Detention's not the right word, but you know, they're going into quarantine for 2 weeks. That was pretty novel. And then standing up, you know, the hotel quarantine, that was new. I think everyone would be aware we've had quarantine facilities in Australia many years ago, but none of them were really operational on the scale that was required here.
So in terms of ports and airports, so there's an existing authorised officer base there that knew how to do that gig, I'm assuming, or did you have to put new people in?
We had to put new people in. So and I should acknowledge, when I came in, the Department of Health people had already set it up. Some very clever and experienced regulators had done that work. So we were trying to get people from across the Victorian public sector who worked in regulatory roles. So they were comfortable with how to read the law, write a notice, you know, enforce against whatever is there. So that was the first workforce. Then we had to recruit the workforce from there, because we just didn't have enough people, and all of those existing authorised officers who had day jobs had to go back to their day jobs and do that work as well. So the Department of Health HR team worked very, very hard in recruiting authorised officers to come in and do that work. And we had to really invest in getting training for these people, because a lot of them we got from the airline industry. So they were previously pilots or had worked as air stewards or in airports generally, because all of that sort of really slimmed right down. And so they were really good at working with grumpy people in small spaces, but hadn't really had to read legislation or write notices or anything like that before. So we had to quickly stand up some training for people to understand the legislative regime they were working under and how to use their powers properly and appropriately. Because there were human rights considerations in this. They had to make human rights assessments as part of their decision making as well, which is not an easy thing to do, really. It's you really have to think through that. So they got 5 days training, which is lightning speed for anyone who's on this call who's a regulator. I used to compare it when I was talking to the powers that be. If you're a police officer enforcing the law, you get 6 months in the academy. If you're a WorkSafe inspector, you get 3 months training and you're mentored. These guys got 5 days. And then because the need for them was so great, Chris will tell you more about the numbers, but by the time I left in March 2021, we had 500 authorised officers working across
Wow.
international seaports and airports, state airports as well, the domestic, across high-risk industries, the home engagement program, knocking on doors, and also at events, because events became a thing once we started opening up again about how we safely manage people's entry and exit and their behaviours, if you like, at events as well. So the
So how did
thirst
you,
for authorised officers was massive.
yeah, so how did you, in terms of stealing or borrowing or taking, training up AOs that quickly is one thing. We often talk about giving caution to officers who are using powers of entry because you're
Yeah.
infringing on people's rights, but that's very different to effectively, well, I was going to say locking up is not the right word, but taking people's civil liberties away for 2 weeks. How did
Yeah.
where did you get the training program to support that conversation? Did you pick something up off the shelf? Did you bolt it together from other
No.
bits?
There was nothing to pick up off the shelf, as you can imagine, but we partnered with a really fantastic regulatory training organisation, and we worked with them to build the competencies that we needed these people to have. In addition to that, Adam, we really had to work closely with our legal advisors, because you're right, taking someone's liberty away from them for 2 weeks is a very, very big thing to do. So we really had to make sure the notices, the scripts that the authorised officers had that spoke to people when they arrived in Australia was all legal, and that we weren't going to trip ourselves over. So the authorised officers two of them would get on the plane when it arrived and explain what was going to happen. Then as the people got off the plane, the passengers got off the plane, there'd be a group of authorised officers who then would again speak to everyone individually, explain what was going to happen, and they would sign an acknowledgement that they'd been told and what had happened. Then they'd be ferried onto the bus and into the hotel for 2 weeks from there.
So is it fair to say that the training in the first pass then, it was bespoke? You could steal stuff from others, but there's nothing you can just pick up and run. And it was very much task focused. You'll be doing this activity. We're training you to do this activity, as opposed to we're training
Yes.
you to be a general officer.
Yes, that is correct. That is correct. And then as the response grew and as COVID became more widespread, I would say that we worked with other regulators who had skills to do certain things, and the staff. So, for example, WorkSafe played a big role in workplaces and making sure that the workplaces had COVID safe policies, appropriate procedures if someone turned up with COVID, how to support their staff, all of those things. So then we started having to work with the WorkSafes, other Victoria Police. We had to work very closely with Victoria Police. They were doing, at the time, if I just jump forward a bit, Adam, to December 2020, which is when the state borders started getting locked, if you like. The Victoria Police were doing the road borders, and we were doing, Department of Health was doing the air borders domestically. So we had to have authorised officers then at Bendigo, Mildura, Avalon, Tullamarine, and anyone who goes to Tullamarine will know that there's 3 domestic terminals you go to. So trying to find enough staff to cover all of that was a real challenge. So we had to not only train and recruit enough people to do that, but work with other agency who had skills and jurisdiction in those areas to try and support the response.
Just a reminder to those listening, feel free to use the Q&A function to chuck any questions you like. I will feed them in as best I can into the conversation as we go. So it occurs to me that you've got this immense challenge of getting the number of authorised officers who can then go out and do quite specific regulatory work in regional locations where perhaps you don't normally have a high volume of people. How did you resolve this issue? Because it's not easy to find people who are capable of doing that sort of job, let alone in the environment we're in. Because thinking back, everyone was worried about COVID. We didn't really understand it, how it moved. Finding people who are willing to do that work, who are available and can be trained up remotely, presumably, would have been a challenge.
So Department of Health has got regions. So we were lucky enough that there were authorised officers who were trained and had probably worked originally in the response in the early days. So they knew the processes and procedures. So we would pair them. So for example, we know what flights are going into Mildura on any one day, or Bendigo or Avalon. So we'd have the timetables, and we would pair an experienced regional-based authorised officer with some of the new ones. So they had the mentor and the guidance around, if they're working in Bendigo or Mildura, for example, how they needed to do their work. What happened if someone got off a plane in Mildura and they needed to go into a quarantine hotel in Melbourne? How did we get them there? So there were a whole lot of logistic pieces in there as well, because what you couldn't do was put them back on a plane with others when they shouldn't be here and potentially had COVID at that time.
This is a great question in the chat box. Like this chestnut of Commonwealth being under the Constitution being the quarantining, who has power to do quarantine. Like, what was the overlap? How did you resolve some of these early tensions between the state's role versus the Commonwealth's role and staffing it accordingly?
Yeah, I think that was way above my pay grade, I have to say, Adam. I think that was negotiated between ministers, etc. Because, well, as we know, the history says that was all handed to the states. So the states just had to grab the bull by the horn and get the response in order. Which we did. And as you saw, that evolved over time. When Jerome came in as the COVID response commander, he was sort of more the spokesperson at that time. But, my recollection is it was the Premier getting up every day talking about the response and what we were doing at that point. So it was very much sort of led publicly by the Premier, but obviously lots of, ministers involved and senior health officials involved in formulating the response. But I think, when you talk about learnings, obviously, people like Brett Sutton and those experienced public health professionals have worked with infectious diseases in the past. So there's that framework that sort of guided them on infection control and how you minimise transmission.
In terms of recruiting, this concept of a thick market versus a thin market. Thick market, lots of choices, lots of people to go with, lots of expertise, already got a compliance background, versus a thin market. We need these people really quickly. They may not have any compliance background, but they're good people we can train up. They've got other competencies. Was that an active conversation in thinking about who do we select?
Definitely. As I said, when we were looking at some of the cabin crew or stewards, that we're looking at them because they're used to working with people who were confined in a small space and had good customer experience skills. Because a lot of it was, once the detention notice was issued and the passengers were in the hotel, for example, it was sort of customer service and responding to their needs while they're in the hotel quarantine environment, for example. But when we started to go out into workplaces or manage events, that was a different skill set. So we did actively look at anyone who had been an authorised officer and was retired. So we went about creating a pool across the Victorian public sector where people could nominate, and we could draw down on that pool as and when we had to ramp up and down the response. And we also looked at the retired police pool, because they are obviously trained in how to regulate and write notices and use legislation and enforce. So it was a really active discussion because, as I said, and Chris will talk about this in more detail, the thirst for authorised officers to be out there was enormous, and we just couldn't recruit them and train them quickly enough at that time.
So it sounds like at this point, in terms of it's international, it's coming into the country, we've got ports, either marine, domestic, or international ports. The enabling infrastructure sounded like it was there, but you had to build new tools to put people in quarantine, to train people on the specific task. Chris, can I bring you on this? So I'm assuming now we're moving to the next level where it's in the state or it's in the country, and we're thinking about borders. Leanne, you talked about land borders and the role of police. Chris, from your perspective, how does the story change once it's in Australia and we're trying to stop it getting into Victoria? Was there a shift in the conversation? Was there a change in what you needed?
Well, yeah, look, thanks, Adam. And I think it kind of went up and down for the period. So I come on February last year, 2021. And at that stage, if I recall, because it feels like a distant memory, we were on a massive ramp up. I think there was about 300 odd new AOs on the way in, and I think we had about 6 weeks to get them all onboarded. At that stage, I think we'd just come off the back of a bit of a spike over New Year's, where it was in New South Wales, and it was really about trying to protect. Still, the international border focus was still very strong, and there was the ramp up of the Victorian borders. There had been a shutdown over New Year's, if I remember correctly. There, it was just before I got there, but we were on that ramp up to 300 because they were starting to look for a very big, visible authorised officer presence, and that was largely the big ramp up was in that industry business regulation side of things, while we were continuing everything else. And so over the next, if I could just go at the high level for a minute. It really then chopped and changed for the next through till about Christmas, and it was more the two main pieces were constantly shifting the focus and the resource to where the problems were and being able to grow. So the fundamentals were all there. I came in at a great stage where Leanne and as she said, others before and time had kind of built a lot of the fundamentals, and it was really about taking that and evolving it. I think you used the word evolve before. There was an evolution over time of just trying to get it better and refining it and getting quicker and smarter. But I think the initial bit I came into, it was just this constant, okay, we need everybody over there, everyone to the border. No, everyone go and knock on doors. And it was just this constant shifting and changing. And I think that was the real challenge in that early phase, was that, as you said, that fundamental training was kind of good enough to get you authorised and out there. But then how do you compensate for the fact that you really had to start to move people around? And that's where, if we look to the kind of regulatory practices that we just wholesale stole from others. Early days, VicPol, their involvement had introduced this concept of the operations orders, which were really fantastic sort of tools. We then kind of took that and co-opted that for a purpose where effectively, if you've got an officer that's not necessarily an experienced regulator, we did have some really great experienced regulators from Liquor and Gaming and WorkSafe and others. You craft up a really tight script for someone and say, right, you're going to go to this thing, you're going to look at these points, and if you tick any of these boxes, that's a non-compliance, and then you're going to do this. So we sort of compensated for the lack of training by giving people those really tight running scripts, and we sort of thank VicPol for that. And as Leanne said, we had enough sort of ex-VicPol people that they helped us craft up that approach really tightly. And so that then held us through that period of surging all over the place. So our numbers were, I think you said, at the end of March, we're about 500. We then, not long after, we actually moved, we picked up the whole international arrival operation and moved that over to Hotel Quarantine, the CQV, the COVID Quarantine Victoria, and took that responsibility. Not long after, the domestic borders became the big, so this was probably around April, May. The domestic border stuff, again, if people cast their minds back to last year, it was about trying to keep Victoria at zero. And we had those, as Delta came through, probably August, September, and we were constantly just trying to stop, shut it, get it back down to zero, because everyone had just opened up again, March, April. and everyone was trying to fight hard to not have it all locked down again. And so the the operation sort of lurched from one to the other, and we sort of ramped up. I think at the peak, in the end, well, I'll come back to that in a minute. That's just about we sort of between March and probably around July, we kind of operated in that mode of having to move people around and try to service the demands. And just to pick up as well, we also, so in addition to all the field operations, we also had the exemptions functions. So the team looked after, if you were coming in internationally and you thought you had a reason why you shouldn't need to go into hotel quarantine, we had those applications coming in as well, probably about 100 odd a week. Around that, but we also inherited, there was a domestic, so once the domestic border controls came in and the border permit schemes and the red zones and orange zones, there was an equivalent exemption system for domestic borders, and we inherited that as well. And so those two systems, for anyone online who's got a permissioning system, exemptions are just, it's kind of at the volume we're doing them, they're effectively just the reverse of a permission. You're just exempting people from a blanket rule. And so that's really high volume work. I think at peak, the domestic exemptions were like 1,000 a day, and we had a team of about 200 people running through these. And as Leanne said before, every exemption needed to have a human rights assessment done. So it's not a tick and flick exercise, that you actually needed to consider these things. And so you're running that volume exercise over at one side, and we had, I think we peaked at about 200 at the airport. We probably had 200 people knocking on doors. So there's large volumes of resources, and you really then had to, again, compensate for the fact that you got a very large number of people being supervised by some good quality, people who had some decent backgrounds, but you needed the risk there with the powers that they had, because the pandemic powers, the power to detain, the power to direct a business to basically shut its operation down, these are significant powers. And so we needed to maintain a high level of control on those. And that's where those ops orders really played into that. And then...
So can you describe the ops order? What when you say operations order, what is the operations order?
Okay, so I'll give you one good example. So around QR codes. So around April, May, there'd been a long push to try to get the uptake of check-ins with QR codes. And I think 60-70% of the audience had come along. The businesses were installing the systems and you could have your scanning and everything else. But there was this sort of long tail of 30-odd% who just were lagging picking this up. And I think it was around the middle of April, there was an amnesty declared. So that we'll give you one more month to get these things in place, and then we're going to move to zero tolerance. Now, obviously, as people would appreciate, zero tolerance is a bit of a fraught thing to go out and announce, that you've then got to follow through with it. So, and there were elements of the QR code rules that were a bit ambiguous, sort of adequate signage and these sorts of things that don't really lend themselves towards a black and white approach. And so we chose aspects of it that were a bit clearer, like if you've got no system at all, that's done, you'll get a fine for that. We had to then kind of enshrine all that into a very tight script operational order for AOs, and then that would be briefed down to their level to say, right, you're going to go to these businesses, you're going to observe these things, you're going to look at their signage, you're going to look at their, are they facilitating customers to check in? Have they got a system? Is it operating? So you gave them a really clear checklist, and then you gave them effectively the points of proof. So if you identify, if you tick any of these boxes, if they're not doing or they are doing any of these things, that's a non-compliance, and then here's your next steps. So it was kind of scripting people through it. Not everybody needed to rely on that, but it gave us consistency. So it was a bit of a shortcut, but it also gave us confidence. And then you could basically just monitor what was actually occurring through the IT platform to see that it was largely operating consistent with those orders that you put in place.
So that example you're giving is when we're moving into that business interaction phase where we've got controls at a local business level.
Yeah.
Leanne, can I quickly throw this one back to you? Were those operational orders and those running scripts, did you deploy that method as well in the early phase at a port entry level?
Not with the port entry level. I guess we had what I would call manuals, so guidance manuals that would instruct an officer at the airport or at the seaport around what they needed to do and the process they needed to follow. So we had it more like manuals like that. When I was in the chair from June to March, we used operation orders more so when we were going to a particular place. So for example, we might do a joint operation with Victoria Police where we'd go and have a look at all the businesses in Bendigo to see if they were compliant. So we'd pull an operation order together so that we were really clear who was the officer in charge, what were the phone numbers, who was going to be there, where the briefing point was before the operation commenced, how to report back. So we used it more in that fashion in the early days.
And in terms of that, like, there's a great question here around those use of scripts as a guidance for officers. I'll just put this to both of you. Like, it made sense, I guess, because you're training people really quickly in a narrow sort of, we're doing these operations. Like, how much do you put, value in that type of script model in the circumstances you were in at the time versus the script model, say now, for other regulators listening in going, oh, maybe we could deploy that model?
At that time, Chris, I'll go first if you don't mind. It was crucial. So, for example, you might remember Victoria was the first to start requiring aircrew, international aircrew, to go into hotel quarantine because it was thought they might have posed the same risks as international travellers, so they couldn't be roaming around Melbourne at that point. So we had to provide our authorised officers who at that point had only been detaining passengers with a script of what they had to say, because as you can imagine, the international flight crew weren't very happy about going into hotel quarantine until their next flight. Equally, there was a provision for Victorian-based international aircrew that they could go home to their place provided they'd tested negative. And then the home engagement team would be calling them to make sure that they were in fact quarantining at home until their next flight. So that was confusing and nuanced. So we really had to have a script for international aircrew going into quarantine and Victorian-based international aircrew, because there was different procedures for both. So those scripts were key, and it was done very, very quickly. So the decision to say that all of the international aircrew needed to go into quarantine happened quickly. So we really had to get these scripts turned around very quickly. And the leadership team out at the airport would hold stand-up briefing sessions before each shift to brief the authorised officers on the new process and procedure and what they needed to do, and would be there sort of floating and helping out if there are any concerns. So I would say at that point, with things changing quickly, those scripts were crucial in a way that in a normal regulatory environment, say my current regulatory environment, if we're going to introduce a change about how we regulate things, we'd train all our people, we'd sit them down and give them a training session, we'd do some practice sessions, it'd be incorporated into the manual. There'd be a lot more time than what there was during the COVID response to do that.
Chris, can I throw this one to you? And also, as you're, giving your answer, like, there's another interesting question here around, that you're bumping into the limits of the power of the orders or the bandwidth that you've got to act within those orders. In sort of giving us some thoughts on the script, can you also talk a little bit to, how the script did or didn't serve the fact that sometimes you're working in a framework that couldn't do everything you needed it to do given the circumstances?
Yeah, I think, to Leanne's point, they're a platform. At the end of the day, the authorised officer still has to make a decision. So you can't give the authorised officer the answer, but what you can do is just narrow down all the things they need to consider and think about. So that we kind of evolved the tool as we went on, and this was probably the story of a lot of the platforms we had, where you just continued to try and refine and reuse, and the disciplines continued through those morning briefings. I think virtually every team had morning stand-ups, and you got your rebrief every day. And then as we came later, particularly around when there were border changes, so when we declared Queensland red or Northern Territory went from red to orange, it was really critical because these things were changing daily, and you had to make sure the team was absolutely briefed on what's the rules today, because the rules tomorrow might be different. And that was particularly that period through June through September, October, that was just, we're having directions changes. So at the Uber level, the directions might change on a weekly basis, but then within particularly the border system, the zoning could change every day. And so you've got to change the whole operation. So you needed mechanisms to be able to facilitate that. In terms of the scope of the directions, really they were, and as much, I think people, sometimes the public perception is that the orders were just made to sort of make things easy and blanket rules. They were really, really considered, and the amount of justification, they were always the bare minimum that could be justified against the human rights and against the public health risks. So we could only really enforce them to the extent that they allowed us to, because that was seen as the balanced, level of restriction required that could be justified to manage the public health risk at the time. So we didn't ever seek to try to go beyond, because we weren't sort of enforcing in an absolute sense. We were there to say these are the controls that society needs to try and either stop it getting in the state or stop community spread. And so it was our boundaries were constantly being redefined, but the extent of it was the judgment from a public health risk basis of how far we could push the restrictions. So it was kind of a self-limiting set of rules. But within that, we also, I think, going back to your cue at the start, so we are the regulatory model. So that kind of evolved a bit over time as well. And if you were to go and look on the Department of Health website today, that the final compliance enforcement policy ends up, that is actually in there. It's just not quite as nice a graphic, but it's the same concept. And we really started to introduce that modern regulatory concept as we went, and started to nuance the compliance enforcement policy down by program. So our approach to public events would be a bit different to maybe our approach to the household engagement program. Some industries who had a lot of preparation and work got a much harder enforcement approach than maybe some of the industries that had been brought into the fold recently. So you had to kind of nuance what you did. And again, our vessel for that was some of those sort of scripts and operations orders, because you were, I think early days, at least when I came on board, it was probably a bit unrealistic to try and be that nuanced. You had to kind of be, reasonably consistent across the board. But as time moved on, I think the public expectation was you had to be a bit nuanced, because you didn't want to be seen to be whacking people with a big stick who were genuinely just in need of a bit of education. So that became a real challenge over time. But again, you sort of had to move with those expectations. That sort of license to operate came through, playing within the boundaries of whatever the orders said, and not being seen to be too punitive.
I imagine there's some people listening to this going, well, normally the inform and educate piece is quite important in saying, this is what the law is, or this is what the requirement is, this is what we need you to do for these reasons. When the rules are changing so rapidly, your ability to communicate your expectations is an ever-moving feast. Leanne, can I throw this one to you? Like in the early phases where perhaps you really didn't know the amount of information that obviously we know now, how could you even do inform and educate to say, look, this is what we expect of you, these are what the standards expect, given that it sounds like it was a pretty moving feast?
Yeah, it was. And the inform and educate piece that you would do as part of your normal regulatory practice as a regulator was really different in that environment, because the way people were getting informed was through watching the daily press conferences about what was happening and what the rules were. I don't think people were generally going, or the layperson was looking at health orders. So Department of Health would sort of try and put something on their website. We'd hear the daily press conference about what was changing. And our approach really was to go out and enforce mainly. But the setting was, depending on the setting, that changed. So, airports and seaports, it was clear. So we're straight to enforcement there. You just got your notice and off you went. But if you're dealing with the business community, for example, we would take a pragmatic approach where we'd go out and say, right, here's what you're required to have. Show us your COVID health policy. We can see that you've got your tables distance at 1.5 metres apart. That's good. You've got your hand sanitizer. You've got your notice up. Where they didn't have all of those things, we'd say, righto, these things are missing. We're going to come back tomorrow. So can you make sure you've got it all in place? So we give them an opportunity to comply, and we'd explain what good looked like. So that approach was really different. The home engagement program, again, you were home or not home kind of thing. So
yeah.
Most people, I saw the question in the chat, most people were pretty compliant, I have to say. We didn't see high levels of non-compliance. Most people did the right thing and understood they needed to stay home. So that was a good thing. Events were different, because with events, so I'm talking soccer, football, big crowds of people. So trying to get people to be compliant, I think everyone knew the risk of transmission. We saw it at the cricket. If you're close to people, then you're likely to get it. So trying to encourage people to stay apart was a real challenge. We had to work really closely with the event organisers and the stadiums to make sure that there were engineering controls in place, if you like, so that people could only enter through every second gate, or only every second seat was sat on, or something like that. So you couldn't just rely on education. You had to have other controls in place, because you knew not everyone either understood or wanted to understand what was required. So you had to sort of try and help through other ways.
And is that an example where traditional regulatory approaches, serving notices that require certain controls or mitigating activity, where that was just sort of standard play? Okay, we'll serve a notice on the MCG, or like how did that translate?
Yeah, I think for us to serve a notice on them at that time, because everyone was sort of trying their best, is what I would say. The MCG and all the big venues, they wanted to be up and running again. They wanted to do the right thing. So we would work more at what I'd call the left-hand side of the compliance and enforcement spectrum, which would be engagement. So before the event, we'd be involved, and later on there was an events team where all of this was really nailed down, and we had COVID safe plans and all of that. So for example, the tennis, the Australian Open, that was really managed within an inch of its life. But with the early the cricket and some of the soccer matches, that was really engaging with those stadiums to say, hey, this is what we expect. We're going to be here. The police are going to be here, and we're going to keep an eye on it. And we'll debrief with you at the end of the day and say, this worked well. You need to do more of this. That hasn't gone very well, and we want you to fix that for tomorrow. So we kind of took that approach, because writing notices wasn't going to produce the outcomes that we needed. So that engagement with them and working collaboratively to get the outcome that we all needed was the better and preferred approach.
So far more hands-on. It's more than support to comply. Like, you're working collectively to try to resolve it at an individual site level.
Yep. And it meant we could learn as well about how these things should run, what were the issues, so that the next one we had more insight to say, righto, from the cricket we learned this, so we recommend you do this, this and this to manage, interactions or crowd levels or whatever it might have been.
Chris, can I bring you on this one? Because in my head is major hazard facilities, larger facilities where you work differently with the duty holder than you would ordinarily. Like, you've got both a major hazards background in your petroleum experience, but also you worked for the Grand Prix Corporation for many years in terms of major events. Like, how do you translate your regulatory head, expanding on what Leanne was saying around major events? How do these two dovetail, and could you steal learnings from WorkSafe and EPA to deal with some of this?
Yeah, look, I think what Leanne's describing there, and this is really where just simply taking those modern regulatory approaches. And so, I mean, obviously my background with EPA and WorkSafe, but every other regulator as well. We probably moved in those early stages when really, I think you've got to kind of put yourself in a duty holder's shoes, saying, do they actually know what they need to do? If they had opportunities to fix the problem, and you try and give them assistance when they're willing. I think over time, it's fair to say between that sort of March, April through to, if you look close to the end of the year, we were issuing a lot more notices. We did do notices on events. I think the differentiation with probably events is, if it's a one-off event, there's no point writing a notice, because by the time you get it printed and handed to them, the event's over. But for places like some of the sporting venues, and we ended up pivoting a fair bit to trying to manage it via the venue, a few venues found themselves on the end. But these are improvement notices. They're not a punishment. They were just simply saying, implement these practices. And again, as we saw good practice, we tried to transfer that as much as possible. And I think that's the regulatory piece that's the most important, is that encouraging high performances. So we know this event can do these things. And interestingly, we found a great example of this was the Tale of Two Rodeos. So we did the big events, but we also did a lot of small ones. We went to one. There's one up. I won't name it, but up near Benalla, a rodeo, and it was a bit of a mess. And we turned up, and they weren't checking people in, and all the locals were jumping the back fence, and it was just all the things wrong. And we came within a hair's breadth of actually just shutting the whole thing down, but we let them sort of persevere through. The next day, another very small town rodeo, spotless and perfect. Same, small group of local volunteers running the show. So things, but you could see how well it could be done, and that also for the field officers who maybe hadn't been to one of these before, it helped calibrate them as well. So once you see something good, you then know what you're judging everybody else against. So having that as the experience grew, and we got more confidence, one, to be able to articulate what good looked like, which is you need to be able to do to write the notice, but two, it kind of started to calibrate your sense of, well, how far should we be pushing people here, because what's a reasonable approach? And so those things very much were borrowed from the sort of WorkSafe EPA way of doing things over time. But it is it's fascinating because you compare that. So we then once about July, August, we actually stepped out of the full high risk industry space. A lot of that got passed over to DJCS. We then focused on the medical and health professionals end of the world. So the sort of allied health chiropractors, but medical practitioners. It was seen a bit of media coverage of, because once a lot of the mandatory vaccination rules came in, there started to become a bit of a black market in, either vaccination certificates or exemptions, and some providers who were maybe not going through the full diligence in providing these things. So we spent a lot of time, and that's a whole different environment when you're regulating medical practitioners. So we're taking people who've been doing visits to events or doing visits to abattoirs or other places. Now we're sending them into a chiropractor suite. And that's a big shift in the approach you need to take. And that was very much more of a traditional investigative approach, because you were basically, seizing records and having to go deep diving. And we, there are a number of those that are underway, so I can't really give any examples, but that required us to pull in, Vic Police because there were elements of fraud, and also APRA because there were professional standards. And I think we ended up with a few people being deregistered off the back of that. So we sort of moved to that space, and then you mix that as well with the border piece. So the border piece around sort of September, October, when we had the extreme risk, when New South Wales was declared the extreme risk zone. So we were meeting every single flight that came in that was either a red zone or an extreme risk zone. Every plane got met and every passenger got checked. And in the case of the extreme risk zone, again, off the back of an announcement that there'd be zero tolerance, you had to not only sort out the permit issue, but every one of them was considered for a fine. And then there's an evidentiary base for that. And so there was a lot of work that got generated off the back of this. I mentioned before, I think we peaked at about 200 at the airport, which probably sounds like a lot. But as Leanne mentioned before, you're running 3 shifts because you're doing 5 in the morning till midnight, which is largely the day's coverage. And you've got 3 terminals on the go and you're trying to meet every flight. So you end up with sort of 60 people madly scrambling from Terminal 4 to meet one at Terminal 1. And that whole operation, was pretty much like clockwork for about 3 months. And I think we ended up with 1,000 visits that were considered for infringements. And we caught, there's a great one that I think got some media where, there were 2 individuals who were stopped and put in the hotel quarantine, both tested positive. And this was a case when we were 0 in Victoria, and those 2 had come to Melbourne to go to a big community social event, which probably would have turned into a super spreader. So, you were in constant, constantly trying to stop the flow of these things and get us to 0. And I think there was a huge, once Omicron took on and we sort of had to pivot to the living with COVID settings, that was a big fundamental shift for us. So up until that point, and I think this is one I did want to share quickly, was because we're talking about, what wisdom did we take from other regulators? I think most of this story is about, well, there was nothing off the shelf you could take. Everything was pretty much the first time this had been done, but we did borrow. And I thankfully, after about 6 months or so after Leanne left, and I've been running a solo for a while, I did get a twin. Some people may know James Florent. Anyway, he popped in. So he brought back some of his regulatory experience was DELP, and also over Digital, and interoperability became the big thing. And so we actually moved the whole operation because we had quite a large number of people, but the demands were still being pulled all over the place. And we went right back and revisited all that policies, procedures, all the platform and the training and those ops orders, and bundled that up and made sure that effectively everybody could kind of do every job, and they knew that they had a home base, but on any given day they may be redeployed elsewhere. And that really gave us that flexibility to stop the lurching and constantly recruiting. And so we moved to kind of almost a steady state operation at the end that was largely based on that DELP sort of principle of fire, interoperability and fire season, that everyone needs to be able to kind of wear multiple hats. And so that was a big saver for us. That's the thing we're in wind up now. The whole operation ends next Thursday. But that really carried us through from sort of October, November last year through till now, is just to continually meet those demands, but being able to just move your resources around. And I think it kind of puts paid a little bit to that. I know the idea of a universal soldier regulator, which I know is kind of this lovely theoretical thing that everyone thinks we should be able to do. And I'm not a believer that you can have a universal soldier, but you can set yourself up to have a good generalist, people whose role is 70% generalist, acknowledging there'll always be a bit of specialisation needed by regulators. But if you set it up, you can actually move people around pretty quickly when you need to, because those demands didn't cease. We were still being pulled all over the place right up until probably February this year.
Well, it really strikes me, and we're rapidly coming to the end, and we could keep talking, but unfortunately we can't. Like, it really strikes me that over the life of the operation, it's really changed modes quite dramatically from, it's not in the country. We're trying to stop it from getting in the country, and we're drawing on traditional powers relating to quarantine and having to nuance them for detention at ports, at marine, land, airports. Then it's in the country, and we're trying to stop it from moving between borders, and we're trying to deploy resources quickly in a world where we need AOs where there just aren't many. Then it's in Victoria, and then suddenly it's in patches, and we're trying to move the resources to the right patches and communicate to different communities in different languages at different times. And then it's everywhere, and we're moving into practitioner regulation and different types of conduct and events and traditional business regulation door to door, and then home, in people's homes. It's quite an amazing array of different types of regulatory interventions, asking the same group of people to do quite different things. For those who are listening in who have followed the conversation, but it's jumped around. Like, what are your salient takeaways for you, Leanne? Like, what do you want people to hear or be mindful of? If you could offer them a few thoughts, what would you say in closing?
I would say that you can draw on, Chris called it universal soldier, but good regulatory practice. So you can go to the WorkSafes, the EPAs, any of the other regulators, and find things like investigation manuals, inspection manuals, and adapt it. So we had to do that really quickly, using infrastructure that's already there. So when we started issuing infringements, we worked really closely with Fines Victoria, so we could set up our programs so they could spit the infringements out, making sure you've got a little policy team there who can help write the regulatory policy to set the field people up to go out and do their job. Some of those things are needed in every regulator, so you know that, and you've just got to, when you're doing it so quickly, pull in what's already there and just adapt it quickly. But it's all about the staff on the ground and making sure that they're properly prepared, trained, they've got the tools and equipment, their uniforms, simple things like that, cars to get where they need to go. You need to make sure all of that's in place to succeed, and making sure they're properly supported and led is going to be really important as well.
Thanks, Leanne. Chris, your salient takeaways?
Yeah, look, along similar lines, I think it's funny, Jackie Steppenov asked a question right off the bat, is there anything you haven't regulated? And yeah, I've regulated lots of things, but it's kind of all the same. Strip away your subject matter. The basics, fundamentals of good regulation can be applied right across the board. And so a lot of the stuff we took, we did, as Leanne said, sort of repurposed from other regulators, because it's just good regulatory practice. And I think everyone should be confident that you've got your basic first principle stuff, and that applies, and you've got to have the confidence of that platform. And I think that's my only other point I'd make is, what I found along the way, everyone's an expert in regulating. I had police telling me how to regulate, I had lawyers telling me how to regulate. Yeah, I think we've still got a challenge to get regulation recognised as a profession, and you've got to stand your ground and say, no, what a good regulator would do in this case is this thing, not what your idea might be. It's been an interesting journey, but one that I always had confidence, because as I think when Leanne left, I said I'm sort of standing on the shoulders of giants here. There was a great platform to build on, and along the way, you just have to be able to back yourself that good regulatory practice will carry you through. Don't sweat too much about finessing and all the fine detail. Be prepared to make a few mistakes along the way, but learn from those mistakes and change and evolve, because you won't get it right when it's the first time it's ever been done. Fair chance you're going to make a mistake there somewhere. It's how do you then pivot and correct that? And as from a leadership perspective, back your people and trust them. You know, they didn't let us down. Well, we were at 900 people at one stage. You could not possibly control everything. You had to trust that your people were well supported, and smart people will make good decisions as long as they're furnished with the right information. So yeah, it was yeah. There's a whole other seminar in leadership in those sort of settings, but yeah, always trust your people.
Leanne, Chris, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time and your candor. Again, massive topic, but you know what resonates to me is that the skills of good regulatory practice apply and did apply, and where you could steal, you did, and where you needed to weld it together, you did. Often it's the least worst outcome you're desiring in some of these circumstances when everything's moving that quickly. Where did you get the training program to support that conversation? Did you pick something up off the shelf? Did you bolt it together from other bits?
There was nothing to pick up off the shelf, as you can imagine, but we partnered with a really fantastic regulatory training organisation, and we worked with them to build the competencies that we needed these people to have. In addition to that, Adam, we really had to work closely with our legal advisors, because you're right, you know, taking someone's liberty away from them for 2 weeks is a very, very big thing to do. So we really had to make sure the notices, the scripts that the authorised officers had that spoke to people when they arrived in Australia was all legal, and that we weren't going to trip ourselves over. So the authorised officers two of them would get on the plane when it arrived and explain what was going to happen. Then as the people got off the plane, the passengers got off the plane, there'd be a group of authorised officers who then would again speak to everyone individually, explain what was going to happen, and they would sign an acknowledgement that they'd been told and what had happened. Then they'd be ferried onto the bus and into the hotel for 2 weeks from there.
So is it fair to say that the training in the first pass then, it was bespoke? You know, you could steal stuff from others, but there's nothing you can just pick up and run. And it was very much task focused. You'll be doing this activity. We're training you to do this activity, as opposed to we're training you to be a general officer.
Yes, that is correct. That is correct. And then as the response grew and as COVID became more widespread, I would say that we worked with other regulators who had skills to do certain things, and the staff. So for example, WorkSafe played a big role in workplaces and making sure that the workplaces had COVID safe policies, appropriate procedures if someone turned up with COVID, how to support their staff, all of those things. So then we started having to work with the WorkSafes, other Victoria Police. We had to work very closely with Victoria Police. They were doing, at the time, if I just jump forward a bit, Adam, to December 2020, which is when the state borders started getting locked, if you like. The Victoria Police were doing the road borders, and we were doing, Department of Health was doing the air borders domestically. So we had to have authorised officers then at Bendigo, Mildura, Avalon, Tullamarine, and anyone who goes to Tullamarine will know that there's 3 domestic terminals you go to. So trying to find enough staff to cover all of that was a real challenge. So we had to not only train and recruit enough people to do that, but work with other agencies who had skills and jurisdiction in those areas to try and support the response.
in terms of recruiting, like, this concept of a thick market versus a thin market. Thick market, lots of choices, lots of people to go with, lots of expertise, already got a compliance background, versus a thin market. We need these people really quickly. They may not have any compliance background, but they're good people we can train up. They've got other competencies. Like, was that an active conversation in thinking about who do we select?
Definitely. As I said, when we were looking at some of the cabin crew or stewards, that we're looking at them because they're used to working with people who were confined in a small space and had good customer experience skills. Because a lot of it was, once the detention notice was issued and the passengers were in the hotel, for example, it was sort of customer service and responding to their needs while they're in the hotel quarantine environment, for example. But when we started to go out into workplaces or manage events, that was a different skill set. So we did actively look at anyone who had been an authorised officer and was retired. So we went about creating a pool across the Victorian public sector where people could nominate, and we could draw down on that pool as and when we had to ramp up and down the response. And we also looked at the retired police pool, because they are obviously trained in how to regulate and write notices and use legislation and enforce. So it was a really active discussion because, as I said, and Chris will talk about this in more detail, the thirst for authorised officers to be out there was enormous, and we just couldn't recruit them and train them quickly enough at that time.
The two main pieces were constantly shifting the focus and the resource to where the problems were and being able to grow. So the fundamentals were all there. I came in at a great stage where, Leanne and as she said, others before time had kind of built a lot of the fundamentals, and was really about taking that and evolving it. I think you used the word evolve before. There was an evolution over time of just trying to get it better and refining it and getting quicker and smarter. But I think the initial bit I came into, it was just this constant, okay, we need everybody over there, everyone to the border. No, everyone go and knock on doors. And it was just this constant shifting and changing. And I think that was the real challenge in that early phase, was that, as we said, that fundamental training was kind of good enough to get you authorised and out there. But then how do you compensate for the fact that you really had to start to move people around? And that's where, if we look to the kind of regulatory practices that we just wholesale stole from others, early days, VicPol, their involvement had introduced this concept of the operations orders, which were really fantastic sort of tools. We then kind of took that and co-opted that for a purpose where, effectively, if you've got an officer that's not necessarily an experienced regulator, we did have some really great experienced regulators from Liquor and Gaming and WorkSafe and others. You craft up a really tight script for someone and say, right, you're going to go to this thing, you're going to look at these points, and if you tick any of these boxes, that's a non-compliance, and then you're going to do this. So we sort of compensated for the lack of training by giving people those really tight running scripts, and we sort of thank VicPol for that. And as Leanne said, we had enough sort of ex-VicPol people that they helped us craft up that approach really tightly.
Can you describe the ops order? What when you say operations order, what is the operations order?
Okay, so I'll give you one good example. So around QR codes. So around April, May, there'd been a long push to try to get the uptake of check-ins with QR codes. And I think 60-70% of the audience had come along. The businesses were installing the systems and you could have your scanning and everything else. But there was this sort of long tail of 30-odd% who just were lagging picking this up. And I think it was around the middle of April, there was an amnesty declared. So that we'll give you one more month. to get these things in place, and then we're going to move to zero tolerance. Now, obviously, as people would appreciate, zero tolerance is a bit of a fraught thing to go out and announce, that you've then got to follow through with it. So, and there were elements of the QR code rules that were a bit ambiguous, sort of adequate signage and these sorts of things that don't really lend themselves towards a black and white approach. And so we chose aspects of it that were a bit clearer. Like if you've got no system at all, that's done, you'll get a fine for that. We had to then kind of enshrine all that into a very tight script operational order for AOs, and then that would be briefed down to their level to say, right, you're going to go to these businesses, you're going to observe these things, you're going to look at their signage, you're going to look at their, are they facilitating customers to check in? Have they got a system? Is it operating? So you gave them a really clear checklist, and then you gave them effectively the points of proof. So if you identify, if you tick any of these boxes, if they're not doing or they are doing any of these things, that's a non-compliance, and then here's your next steps. So it was kind of scripting people through it. Not everybody needed to rely on that, but it gave us consistency. So it was a bit of a shortcut, but it also gave us confidence, and then you could basically just monitor what was actually occurring through the IT platform to see that it was largely operating consistent with those orders that you put in place.
So that example you're giving is when we're moving into that business interaction phase where we've got controls at a local business level.
Yeah.
Leanne, can I quickly throw this one back to you? Were those operational orders and those running scripts, did you deploy that method as well in the early phase at a port entry level?
Not with the port entry level. I guess we had what I would call manuals, so guidance manuals that would instruct an officer at the airport or at the seaport around what they needed to do and the process they needed to follow. So we had it more like manuals like that. When I was in the chair from June to March, we used operation orders more so when we were going to a particular place. So for example, we might do a joint operation with Victoria Police where we'd go and have a look at all the businesses in Bendigo to see if they were compliant. So we'd pull an operation order together so that we were really clear who was the officer in charge, what were the phone numbers, who was going to be there, where the briefing point was before the operation commenced, how to report back. So we used it more in that fashion in the early days.